Well, that was a quick break, but we need to get going. This is a time certain. So, Chief of Staff Tiffany Stanley, do you want to take point on this?
Yes, will do. Thank you. So yes,
This is
Tiffany Stanley,
let
Chief
me
of
just
Staff.
remind everyone it's an information discussion item. So,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah. So as you'll recall, last month we laid the groundwork for this by discussing the findings and the implication of those findings from the funding study that we commissioned back in 2019. What will be presented now are recommendations from the researchers in terms of where those findings have led, and then some modeling of the impacts of those recommendations. So because we reviewed the findings last month, they're going to move very quickly through those and jump to recommendations and pause for questions after each. So just context about how quickly we're trying to move. And also, I believe we're aiming to stick to the hour we have slotted. So we'll just see how far we get and go from there, and take cues from you, Chair Huntsman. But
Okay.
with that, I'll turn it over to West Ed and APA.
Great. Thank you, Tiffany. And I'll just get us started. We're very excited to share these recommendations after the study we conducted, and as Tiffany said, based on the findings we shared at last month's meeting and at the end of the first phase of the study. And we just want to thank everybody for the opportunity to do so. So I'm going to move really quickly in the interest of time through our introduction, but we did want to just highlight the objective for today, which is very straightforward, to share our recommendations. But for each of them, we will talk really briefly about the key findings that informed them. We'll talk a little bit about the goal and the policy alternatives to what we're recommending that we think are just important to have as a consideration. And then potential impact, as Tiffany mentioned, or modeling what might be the impact of implementing the recommendations. And then we will take questions at the end of each recommendation and at the end if there is time. So just to give a quick reminder of the overview of the study, as I alluded to, there was a first phase, and it covered everything listed here and that side of the screen. And then the second phase, which we're wrapping up now with these policy recommendations. And findings from both phases were used and considered in these recommendations. So I wanted to make sure that was clear. So with that, I'll just jump right into them. And I think the first thing I'll just reiterate is we will pause the end of each recommendation for questions. We want to get through kind of the recommendation, the findings, the modeling, and then take questions, and then again at the end if there's time. Before we dive in, I just want to review the overall conclusions that we shared at last month's meeting. The first of these being that overall, the study team has concluded that the fundamentals of the funding system in Utah are strong. So we're not really offering recommendations that represent a complete overhaul of these fundamentals. In fact, it's more identifying opportunities to improve within this foundation that we think is really well designed to meet state principles. And we see it as almost a return back to the foundation that was established when the minimum school program was originally enacted. And there are 4 areas in particular that we're focusing on for our recommendations: funding generation, funding distribution or allocation of funds, targeted funding, funding that's more categorical in nature, and then a little bit of a look at what's happening locally in terms of effective practices and how the state can potentially support expanding those effective practices. So I'll also just briefly, again, go over the recommendations in summary so that you have the full picture as we dive into them in detail. And the first recommendation is that funding generation topic, and it is to increase the basic tax levy to rebalance the defined local share in the basic school program, and also will mitigate some impact of other potential system improvements with respect to how the funding system adjusts for differences in context and how that affects different resource needs. The next 3 recommendations all deal with how funds are allocated, distributed, and they focus on different ways in which the system, we think, can be improved to better address differences in resource needs that stem from different contexts. And that includes the size of the economically disadvantaged student population, the scale of the operations, how large a district is, and how expensive it is to hire teachers in a part of the state versus another. We also are making a recommendation that the state re-examine the related to basic programs to optimize how that set of programs are really targeted, how they function within the system to be coherently reflecting strategic intent and priorities, be stable, to be continually improved and evaluated, and to balance well in a systems context with the basic school program. And then our last recommendation is really to create a competitive grant that's focused on supporting schools to develop and to improve at scale some effective processes within 3 key strategic areas. So then the other thing we wanted to do before we dive in is to talk about where these recommendations fit within the system as we're kind of conceptualizing it. And we've shared this graphic before, I believe, with this group. But essentially, it follows the flow as we see it of the funding from how the funds are prioritized and appropriated to how they're distributed and how they're balancing sources of local and state funds. And then what happens once they're received locally in terms of how they're expended at the local level. And so recommendation 1 is very much in that sources side of things and the funding generation where it comes from state or local. Recommendations 2, 3, and 4 are really all in that distribution, allocation of funds, part of the system. Recommendation 5 we see as being a part of how the state thinks about priorities and appropriating funds. And then recommendation 6 is really at that local level. What happens with the funds? How does the state really support, encourage effective practices locally? And with that, I will turn it over to Justin to talk about our first recommendation.
So as we talk about the recommendation on increasing the basic tax levy, this is focused on this funding generation and that balance between state and local sources that we discussed a couple weeks ago. So if we go to the next slide, our findings that really drove this in phase 1, so the next bullet, we were really focused on fiscal neutrality and this concept of how closely linked are the resources students have available for them and the property wealth of the district. And so what we are finding is that that neutrality is not at the level we'd want. So there is a pretty distinct link between that property wealth and the resources students have. And as you can see in this table, you don't want to see a correlation coefficient above 0.5. And in all the places you see those bright green arrows, we were seeing that, especially in 17 and 18. So we're seeing a lot of correlation coefficients above 0.5, be it if you're looking at state and local revenue or total revenue, if you're looking at it for raw students or weighted by student characteristics. Over and over, we were seeing it get above 0.5 and actually getting a little bit worse generally from 13, 14 to 17, 18. So that link was higher than we'd like to see. If we go to the next slide, what we also found is that Utah is generally more reliant on state funding than the national average. And we don't believe there's a link between overall equity of the system and that kind of balance between state and local. And what you'll see on slide 13 is that there's been a bit of a U pattern over that kind of decade we were able to look at, with the anomaly being during the era funding from the feds. There was a lot of federal funding coming in. But if you look at 15, 16, and 05, 06, Utah's on average about 5 percentage points higher in their state share than the national average, around 4 percentage points lower in local share. And so there's just that heavier reliance on state dollars than what you see in other states. And again, we don't think that split in of itself creates or impacts equity in any way. Then as we moved into phase 2, we started to really try to unpackage some of this. And one of the first things we noticed as we started to look at fiscal neutrality and where local wealth was coming from is that the current equalization policies Utah has, especially around their board and voted leeways, they're not mitigating, they're in fact increasing this issue with fiscal neutrality. And you can see that on the slide 15, on the bottom piece here. When you look at all revenues, regardless of how they're being raised, you have really, you have the big fiscal neutrality issues. When you pull back the board and voted leeways, you actually see the system's it's doing a good job on fiscal neutrality. Everything drops below that 0.5 issue. So what is throwing off the fiscal neutrality in the state really are the board and voted leeways. And so that's one of the issues that we found in the system. And so the next thing we try to do is say, well, is there something going on district by district that could help address that? And what is true is that just doesn't seem to be possible, because not only are the wealthier districts currently raising more dollars, they also have the most capacity left to raise additional dollars. And you can see that in slide 17. There are a handful of districts on the left side of this chart that have capacity, and some have all of their capacity remaining. So any place you see light blue is additional local capacity remaining. But what the scale on this is a per pupil amount. And so you'll see the districts on the right, who are your wealthiest property districts, they all have the most capacity overall, and many of them have more capacity left than any other district in the state. So you can't really solve any of the fiscal neutrality issues by, fully by digging into the voted and board leeways. We've got two more findings that came out of phase 2. The first is that we went out to Ed Week and we looked and ranked all of the states, who rank all the states' school finance systems with a letter grade on equity. We looked at the top, the most equitable and the least equitable. And what we found is that the most equitable states have most of their funding going through their state school finance formula. So they are not relying on local dollars that are held locally and spent locally. They're relying on the overall system to drive the priorities of the state. And then what we also found is looking at the basic levy in Utah and comparing that rate to other states who use a fixed dollar or a fixed rate to drive their systems. Utah's rate, which we can see on the next slide, is actually the second lowest of any of the states we looked at, and New Mexico seems to be a bit of an anomaly how low they are. So Utah is very low in kind of what they're asking taxpayers to pay as part of their overall school finance system. So so those were the findings we just went through. We're going to bump over to slide 21, and this is the recommendation, which Alex had talked about a little bit. It's to increase the basic tax levy. And we want to do this really for two reasons. One, to rebalance that split between state and local, so get more reliance on local share. And then second, if we do that, free up some of the some capacity, we hope, in the system to focus on those student equity or the distributional equity issues that we're going to talk about later in the presentation. So giving the states some ability to go that way. There are alternatives, and for each, or for many of the recommendations, we'll talk about an alternative. You could go to the board, the voted and board leeways, try to either increase caps or really change how you're equalizing and get more equalization at the lower property wealth districts. We don't think it does quite the same thing, but that would be kind of the alternative to this recommendation. And then we have two examples of kind of what the impacts are here. In each of the next two slides, what we're going to model are three scenarios. The first, on this one at the bottom, the darker blue, is the current basic levy. And what you see on the left side is the percent of the basic school program each district is taking up based on the current levy. And then the lighter blue is if we went up to a 0.0002, and then the gray line is if basic levy went up 50%, which would increase the local share of the basic school program from 17% to 25%. I mean, what you'll see is the higher property wealth districts start to get much higher shares of their total basic school program. The lowest property wealth districts have to increase, but they're still going to get the vast majority of their funding from state revenue. And so you just start to see the shift, what will happen for the districts. We did exclude Park City here just because they are almost off the chart and it kind of skews the chart. They are already over 100% of BSP and would get above 180% of BSP at the 50% increase. And so slide 24 starts to show what it would be raised per pupil. Again, the dark blue is the current basic levy. The next box up would be if it was increased to 0.002, and then the light blue is if it went up that 50%. What we do want to highlight is that over at Park City, you would start to really think of recapture because they'd be raising more than their basic school program at a per pupil level calls for. But also highlighting again that what you're really doing is getting a lot of capacity generation from your property wealthy districts in order to increase local share. And then, in a constant state, that would really decrease state share. And so you're leveraging the wealth in those wealthier places. And I will open it up for questions. And we flew through that, so.
Are there any questions, Chair Huntsman? I'm not sure if I can see that on my end. Perhaps not, or perhaps he had to step away. Can anyone else see? Otherwise, we can just jump to the next and then circle back to questions.
This is Board Member Earl. I do have my hand up. I guess if no one's able to see.
I can see them all. It's Carol. I can see.
Go ahead and
I can see
take
Danny.
place till we hear from Chair Huntsman.
Okay, do you want me to go ahead?
Yeah,
with
go ahead, Board
questions?
Member Earl.
Let me understand. So your recommendation is to raise that local levy. But what you mean is, I just want to make sure I understand this. When you say that, you're going to raise the ability for local people to raise their levy. So whether or not they choose to raise the levy would be based on local decisions to increase the taxes in their area. Am I accurate in saying that, or is it actually something you're asking the state to do to increase those local, not just in, okay, so yes. And maybe I answered my question. Does that make sense what I'm asking?
It does. And what we are recommending here is that you would actually raise the basic levy for all districts in order to increase the local share.
So
This
that
is
would,
not that would be across the board, everyone paying the same still. It just would be at a higher level.
okay, so this isn't the voted levy at all, right? This is just in general, you're just asking to raise this. Can you refresh my memory from one of the previous slides, not in this one, but previous ones? Park City doesn't get any, no, it's not on this one. Park City doesn't get any, very little % of state funding anyways. Is that accurate? Like
I
it's,
believe that
they almost self-fund themselves, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So this is an interesting thing here as to whether Park City will maybe want to even continue to engage in this capacity without going somewhere by themselves, right? If this is what it's going to do. Let me see. So, okay, let me see what my other question was. All right, I might have to come back. I'm looking down my list here. Sorry.
Board Member Davis.
Thanks. Appreciate the information. It's really helpful. I'm just curious as to your findings about special education. I mean, that typically is our greatest area of inequity when it comes to funding, and what your findings are and where those recommendations are coming, or is that going to come in the next phase, or how does that fit in?
I can jump in on this question. So we will be talking about recommendations that deal with distribution and how well it adjusts for differences in context and different resource needs, including, for example, differences in the needs of certain student populations. We do not have any recommendations with respect to students with disabilities. The recommendation we have in student populations is for economically disadvantaged students. And so we just are not at this time recommending any changes to how the system currently funds and adjust for the additional needs for those students.
May I follow up, Chair?
Yes.
Sorry.
I just find that really surprising. Are the recommendations not coming because of the data you found that there is not a need in that space? Or I guess what's the impetus?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll be brief, but just because for time. But what I will say is that the cost function analysis is where our ability to sort of look at evidence around student needs and how those are different. And with respect to students with disabilities in particular, we found a couple of things that limited how well we were able to look at that, and therefore limited how much we wanted to kind of draw implications from the findings. And the major issue is that there's a lot of resources that are supporting sort of those students to reach outcomes we just don't have a good measure for. And the analysis that we conducted really relies on being able to look at those outcomes and how, as you try to make sure all students have the ability to reach the same outcomes or reasonably equal opportunity to reach the outcomes, that the spending adjusts for what they need to do that. Students with disabilities, there are outcomes that are really important, but that are not, like I said, something we have a good measure that's statewide for that we could include. So the outcomes we were able to include were test scores and graduation. And I think that as a result of that, it limits how well we're able to look at how much. So that being said, our analysis did find that students with disabilities do have additional needs, as you would expect, than their peers, but that we felt the magnitude of the finding doesn't reflect the full scope of additional needs. It just reflects, it's sort of best interpreted as reflecting the portion of it that is supporting very specifically their outcomes on those academic measures. And so I think we just felt that there wasn't a strong enough ability for us to zero in on that to make a recommendation. And there's a lot more I could say about it. I'm trying to think about time and how far to go into it, but I'm hoping that addresses your question, Board Member Davis. And then we're also happy to follow up on any question, including this sort of in more detail in writing, just depending on time for this meeting in particular. So.
Yeah, it sounds like you couldn't do it because the data, differences in IEPs and things like that is not accessible. But that's precarious. I guess we're going to have to figure that out on our end. Thank you.
Yeah, no, happy to answer the question. Like I said, there's quite a bit to talk about in terms of this issue. So I don't want to sell it short, but I did want to think about time. So I'll turn it back over to Justin if there are questions about recommendation 1. I see a few more hands, so I want to make sure
There's still quite a few hands there. And Vice Chair Cummins, thanks. I had to jump off and get back on, and I have my civic clerk back. So yay, I'm back in business. So are you taking questions right now, or are you wanting to be at the end?
Yeah, we're taking questions on finding number 1. So everyone who has their hand raised now is wanting to ask a question on that finding.
Okay, and Board Member Davis asked her question.
Yes.
Your hand's raised. Brittany, did you have a question?
I do. Just really quick, I don't know if in this study you looked at any historical information on the basic rate. I don't have a very good recollection of what happened, but as a board member, I recall that it was maybe about 4 or 5 years ago that the basic rate was set as a frozen rate instead of having it vary for revenue each year. So I'm just curious if you were able to acquire any information, or if there was any information available on why the basic rate was set at the level that it was at that time.
I will have to go, and maybe Alex has that piece. I can go back and take a look. I don't have that with me right this second.
Okay. Did you have a follow-up, Brittany? Vice Chair Cummins?
No, I was just wondering if that was readily available information, or if there was any information on the reasoning on that number.
Board Member Lear?
I had a question similar to Jenny Earls. I'm trying to make sense of the conclusion about increasing the basic tax levy. I can't quite, it feels like a circular answer, because I feel like allowing the locals to raise their basic tax levy only helps those that already have enough money. I feel like the locals who haven't raised their basic tax levy, they haven't because they can't. And so I feel like that's a false hope. Am I misunderstanding that? Can you help me explain this?
I think you're actually hitting the nail on the head of where we got there and making it pretty clear. I just didn't walk through this explanation well enough. I think that's exactly what we are finding, is that if you kept relying on voted and board levies or leeways and locals to do it themselves, that the disparities both can get greater because your wealthiest districts have so much capacity to keep levying, and it's been difficult in some areas, even with the, what is a good equal kind of support system at the lower property wealth districts to get districts to do this. So I think the recommendation around the basic tax levy and moving it for all districts, so it'd be a state action to move it for all districts. It's not really a choice. creates more capacity, and it just means it kind of has to get done. It's a pretty small dollar amount in your lowest per pupil wealth districts, and it's a much higher amount that would be raised in your wealthiest, but that's going to then offset how much state money those wealthier are getting, which frees up state dollars actually to take care of other needs. So in the end, what it really is trying to do is take that 55, kind of 37% state local balance today and shift it to something different where there's more local coming in, because every district's going to be at this higher mill rate. So it's not the voted and board, it's really specifically to the basic tax levy that everybody would have to raise.
Can I follow up a minute,
Follow
Chair?
up there. Follow up, Board Member Lear.
I'm just, and I don't, this isn't really a question because you've explained or at least confirmed what I thought, but I'm concerned that it doesn't really help us solve the problem, because the boards raising their own rates are reflective of what could be a voted board levy too. They're not raising their, no matter how big the ceiling is, if that's raised, I feel like we're still not going to be able to raise more money at the local level, because those same LEAs districts have had unsuccessful votes for levies. So I'm just, I don't know. It just doesn't seem like a useful recommendation to me. And maybe I just need to think more about it, but it feels like something theoretically that would work, but we know doesn't work, because these same districts have been unsuccessful on many voted levies for the most part, if that makes any sense either. Thanks. That's all I had.
Okay.
Chair, Board Member Lear, may I
Yes.
comment? This is Angie Stallings, Chair.
You bet, Angie.
I'd love that.
Thank you. I just love the opportunity. And again, this is Angie Stallings, Deputy Superintendent of Policy, speaking for the first time today. So just wanted to clarify, Board Member Lear, as a reminder, as that levy is imposed by the legislature, again, as has been stated, it would be imposed by the legislature, but then collected at the local levy or the local level. So those local boards would not have truth and taxation hearings on that. That's done at the legislative level. The other thing to remember is that if you look at the graphic that's on the screen right now, you'll see South San Pete on one side, Park City on the other. So for a South San Pete, for example, very little revenue is going to be collected by that increase in the basic levy. You can see it's a very small dollar amount. But what you don't see is that then the rest of the funding that funds the WPU for South San Pete is going to be state funding. So if you kind of think about that white area as being filled in with state dollars, you can see that Park City would get 0 state dollars. Rich would get maybe 1/3 of their funding from state dollars, whereas 2/3 would be funded by that property tax. And then all the way down in South San Pete, they'd be contributing maybe 10 at the most % of the amount of funding that they're getting for the basic school program would be in property tax. All that white area, essentially 90% of the revenue they're getting would actually be from the income tax or education fund. So what this does is, as you increase the amounts in those districts on the left-hand side, it actually, as was stated, frees up additional state dollars so that now you can actually raise the WPU amount higher. Instead of $3,800, for example, per student, now it frees you to be able to add maybe another $200 to each WPU. Does that make sense? Without actually increasing or receiving extra revenue, you bring in more property tax, which then frees up more state to raise the amount of the WPU. I hope that is helpful. I'd be happy to answer more questions though.
Yeah, no, it all of it is helpful. I just, I'm not good at this, so I'm trying to sort of process it. I just don't want a solution to be something that is practically impossible. And I hear what you're explaining about freeing up more state dollars, but sometimes those are then committed to programs that legislators want, but no educators want. And so that's not always a helpful resolution either. So I'm trying to figure it out in my own non-mathematical brain. So thank you.
Thank you. Board Member Earl?
Thank you. I'll be quick. So let me understand the funding that's here in the millions. That's not, is that additional revenues, or so like going from the current to the basic levy at 2.002, that would be about not quite $100 million additional funding? Or is this, does that make sense? Or is that the additional 552 million is what the full amount, or is it just the 100 million, or about that? It's not, it's a little less than that. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yes, so the bottom line is what's current, so it's currently raised, and then everything above that is the marginal amount that would be additional.
Okay, and so one last question. So I'm looking at these blue lines on the recommendations. Would you say that in most districts, this would increase a taxpayer's burden for their property by, it looks like on most of these, it would be a third to half an additional amount. Do you have an estimate on how much taxpayers' burden would be?
Yeah, so on average, it's going to be about that 50%, because that really at
So it would be a
you know,
50% increase on their property taxes. Okay, that's what I want to know.
Yep.
Okay, I'm not seeing any
Chair?
other. Yes.
Sorry, just really quick to add to what Board Member Earl said, it wouldn't be a 50% increase on their property taxes as a whole, just that small portion of the basic rate. So just to be clear, it's not that huge of an impact on the full tax burden, property tax burden of an individual. Sorry, just wanted to make sure that was stated.
That's a great clarification.
That is true, but it would be, this is a considerable amount of what people do pay in property taxes, at least at my house. I don't know if someone else's it's considerable less, but it would increase that education component by 50%, right?
It could. Let me just go on. It could. And of course, this is a possibility. This is basically saying that there is an opportunity if. It's about where do you find funding for public education, and that's what this is saying. Is this is a possibility, but is it a reality? It depends on what they do at the local level.
Well, this isn't local funding though, right? This is state funding. So anyway, okay, thank you.
And just if I could just jump in on that question, just to add a little, and this is Alex Jacobson for the record. I didn't say that before, so I apologize for that. I think that the way that this is an imposed levy, as was mentioned, it would be for all, it would go up because the basic tax levy is set by the legislature. However, the total tax burden includes voted and board. So I believe it's correct to say that if locally those were adjusted, then overall the burden could be affected differently than how much the basic tax levy changes. So there's an opportunity locally to make decisions about how much is contributed through the other parts of the tax burden, and that would influence on net how it changed overall. Make that clarification.
Okay. I think that's Angie, your hand's still up, and Board Member Earl. So Deputy Superintendent Stallings, your hands are still raised. But I think we resolved your question. So please continue.
All right. So again, Alex Jacobson for the record, and I'm going to take over for the next three recommendations. And just to call back to the question that was asked earlier about student populations and additional resource needs. And I think more generally, this idea of whether certain communities have additional needs because of their context in order for them to reach the same or to provide same equal educational opportunities for their students, whether there are additional resource needs that would imply additional funding for those communities. And there are three areas that we're looking at with these recommendations. One is with respect to economically disadvantaged students and the additional resource needs for those students in particular, the impact of economies of scale, the impact of the scale of a district's operations on how much they need to provide the same equal educational opportunities to their peers. And then the effect of how local prices for teacher labor, teacher salaries, how that can change what amount of resources are required. And so I'm going to get us started one note I want to make before I jump into the findings is just that with respect to these analyses and these recommendations, the cost function analysis was the primary source for our evidence that kind of informs us in the findings. And I think it's important to just start off by noting the cost function analysis primarily because of data limitations, but also because of the unique context of charter schools. Charter schools were not included in the model itself. So I think that's important to make that note. That being said, we absolutely recognize that that sector in the state is very important to the overall, education of students. And so what we've done is we've thought, kind of try to be really thoughtful about each recommendation. And even though those schools weren't included in the cost function model, we thought about which recommendations we think could be extended to that sector, because we believe it's likely the case that the resource needs are very similar or the same, and which ones we think require some additional analysis, some sort of very specific look at the charter sector before we would recommend extending them. So I wanted to make that note in each recommendation. I'll talk a little bit more about this as well. So first, I'm just going to move through the findings really pretty quickly for economically disadvantaged students. Our first finding was from phase 1 and just suggested there's likely some opportunity for improving how well the system addresses their additional needs. This is a callback to the table from that report. The second finding that we're drawing on is from the cost function, and it essentially we found that as the population of economically disadvantaged students increases, as it grows, predicted spending increases when you hold student outcomes and all other cost factors constant. So if we're trying to understand how do resource needs change just based on the change in this population, we're finding that as it grows, resource needs also grow. And this is what that trend looks like as percentage of economically disadvantaged students increases, predicted cost increases. Another important finding is when we take those results and we turn that into sort of what it implies in terms of a pupil weight, and compare that to what the weights are in sort of the prior literature and sort of common across literature in this area, and also what we're able to estimate is currently being provided specifically for this population of students in the state, we find that what's implied by the cost function is much larger than what is currently effectively provided. And this is based on a variety of programs that do contribute to these additional needs for these students, at-risk students, economically disadvantaged students. However, whichever way you look at it, the total amount of funding that's provided for those students represents a much smaller weight than what we found in our analysis. And then the last finding that we're drawing on for this recommendation is that as in the cost function model, when we look at how the predicted spending changes as outcomes, student outcomes increase, holding all else constant, we're finding that spending also goes up. So that it's a little difficult to sort of counterintuitive, but what that's saying is that as your outcomes are growing up, you're spending more when you take into account everything else that influences what you have to spend. So that just suggests that more spending is associated with greater outcomes, which I think is probably something we would have suspected, but obviously there are differences in how well spending is allocated, and that is accounted for in our model, and that's something we can talk about more if there's questions, but I just want to note that efficiency of spending is accounted for to some extent in the model. But these are the sort of trends for that finding. And again, the reason why this is, I think, why we wanted to present this for this recommendation is just to provide evidence that additional investments, especially investments in students, we're seeing evidence that those will affect positively their outcomes. So taking all of these findings together, we're recommending that in the basic school program, an add-on WPU be created for economically disadvantaged students. And there are a couple of goals that this would serve. The first is just to expand the additional resources. As I noted, the weight that we're finding with our analysis is much greater than the weight that we're sort of able to pull from the current system based on the programs that are targeting funds to these students. And so we think that additional resources are needed because the resource needs are greater than what's being adjusted for currently. And also that it would be embedding this adjustment in the basic school program, which reflects how foundational, so we see it as to sort of the meeting the principle of the minimum school program to provide for reasonably equal educational opportunities. being in the basic school program, it's adjusted and aligned with the WPU value and is part of that core of the formula. But the alternative that we wanted to note here is that additional funding could be provided, additional investment could be provided through the EARS program or a program like it, rather than going to an add-on WPU. And that would be one way to provide this additional support, but through a different mechanism. That is an option. We're recommending the other for the reasons I mentioned about the sort of foundational status of this type of an adjustment, but that's an alternative that exists. So then in terms of modeling the impact, what this graphic is showing is the percent increase above current BSP funds that would result from 3 scenarios of an add-on weight. And these 3 scenarios reflect the range of uncertainty in our analysis, so that there's never a perfectly certain result. And we wanted to give that, really illustrate that uncertainty. There's some uncertainty about, what the weight would be, and we think this is the appropriate range. So it ranges from 0.32 to 0.52, with 0.42 being kind of the point that the analysis is, that's the estimate, and the other 2 represent the range. So again, what you're seeing here is the percent increase in funds for districts based on each of these different weights, the dark blue being the bottom of the range, the lighter blue being the middle, and then the sort of turquoise on top being the additional. And the other thing I'll say is that it's ordered in the greatest to least in terms of additional funding. And also in parentheticals, you see the rank in terms of percent economically disadvantaged students. And as you would expect, as you have a larger percentage, you're on the far end of the sort of on the higher end of what additional funds will be received. But because it is a pupil weight, percent economically disadvantaged doesn't necessarily put you in that order in terms of your rank. And also, I think that it's a percent above what's currently received. And so what's currently available in the BSP is impacted by all the other programs in the basic school program. So with that, I'll stop and open for questions.
Okay, questions? Board Member Cannon?
Thank you. Cindy's question regarding special education WPUs made me pause to think about what you're suggesting here. So as I understand it, currently we have children who are special ed or special needs, and they receive additional WPUs to help with their education. And so I guess I'm wondering how does this increase for economically disadvantaged students mesh with the already increased WPUs that we have going to many of these other students? Would they get, if they're special ed and economically disadvantaged, would they get both add-ons, or how does this all work in terms of add-on WPUs? I think it's a bigger issue than this little part that you're talking about here. So I'd just like clarification, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So that it's a great question. And I think the first thing I'll say is that the cost function model that we ran this is based on did include sort of account for the population of students with disabilities. As I mentioned, we feel like there's limitations in the result for that population, but in terms of the additional needs with respect to, I think most appropriately with respect to academic outcomes that we were able to include, that additional need is accounted for in the model. So I think that it does to some extent pull apart the needs of that population and the needs of the economic disadvantage. And for students who are in both categories, is trying to sort of control for the effect of being in one or the other separately. But it is absolutely something that I think states wrestle with when they think about weights. Some states do have limits. And in fact, in the current EARS program, Enhancement for At-Risk Students, there is built into it a limit on how many of the categories that drive the largest proportion of those funds, as I'm sure all of you know. But as an example, there's a limit on how many categories can be applied because we know how much overlap there is. So I think that that's one way that this could be sort of integrated. Currently, the population of students with disabilities and the economically disadvantaged would be, if this were included, those would be the only 2 add-on WPUs in the basic school program. So there would be only 2 categories, and I think generally duplication is included up to 2, but not always. So that's a question, a policy question we don't have a recommendation for. Then the last thing I'll say in answer to the question is with respect to English learners, we found the overlap between the English learner population and economically disadvantaged population to be so great that it would be difficult for us to pull them apart in our model the way we did with special education and economically disadvantaged. And so the way we would sort of interpret this as reflecting on that population is to say there's so much overlap that this adjustment is also intended to serve the needs of English learners. And so there would be, some ability for districts, I think ideally for them to think about if they have a large EL population, how do they use some of these funds to support the needs that are specific to being English learners as opposed to being economically disadvantaged. So that's the other, I think, important point I would make in response to the question. But I hope that does address the question. Let me know if there's any follow-up there.
You have a follow-up, Board Member Cannon?
No, I appreciate knowing that because I was concerned about ELL students also. But it sounds like were we to do this, we would need to have some caveats, as you suggest, on how this funding works.
Okay. Thank you. Board Member Earl, Board Member Earl.
Yes, I have just a couple of questions. Are we suggesting we're eliminating programs and doing an add-on in place of those programs, or is this in addition to?
So I think our recommendation would be to replace the EARS program and the other few programs that currently specifically target this population, and then move that funding along with the additional funds into a basic school program add-on. But it only would be with respect to programs that serve very specifically this population. So it's a pretty narrow group of programs that went into that effective weight that I shared just a moment ago. The amount that we calculated as being already provided in the system. It's a pretty, I think, narrow slice of programs that we would recommend as part of this be absorbed into this new mechanism for providing for the needs.
So that I'm trying to understand the funding mechanism then. So the funding from those programs would just go into this in place of funding those programs. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's how we're recommending it be done.
Okay.
Because I think the motivation for that is that this is, we believe, the strongest way to adjust for these needs. And an example of in the EARS program, there are sort of 3 ways the funding is determined. And I think not all of them are focused on the student characteristic or student-centered, and this is very much about the students you have, their characteristics, and the needs that come along with it. So yes, that's right.
Okay, I have another question. I'll try to be quick.
So while you're getting your question, I think it'd be really important to know that within this study, these are all, again, proposed things, but it's up to the legislature, again, how they perceive it, and then also how we perceive proposed betterments that come from this study and try to move forward. But this doesn't, I don't think there's anything in the study that's going to say take from this and move it over here. It's just kind of generally implied that something might be that way. But so I just want to make sure we're really clear that there isn't any confusion on this isn't balancing the budget for the legislature and or saying we're going to cut it or making a recommendation to cut a program.
Right, but at the same time, it does give specificity to it. I wanted to make sure we understood, right, where the contents were and what's being suggested here, so we can articulate it later.
Correct.
My question has to do with, so specifically, I'm from Morgan, which I'm very familiar with their process here, and I'm looking there at the very end here, based on their needs and stuff. But they also, contrary to some other areas, they're also at the very end on your first report. They're the very bottom per pupil spending per child for the whole state. In what ways do we prevent it from being? I'm not sure how to phrase it. Do you see what I'm saying? Is that they're competing for huge funding from other areas, anyways, I don't know. I'm not sure how to articulate that. There's a concern that there may be disparities in other ways besides what's listed here financially, to where it may deter a district from doing the things they need to for all their students. So that's just a question. I'm not saying that this builds that, but it does beg the question based on the model here.
I
Alex,
appreciate.
you want to follow up?
I'll just appreciate the comment about the variety of different needs. And I think if you take our recommendations together, I think the intention is to highlight very specific parts of the system we're seeing based on the analysis we conducted, where we see an opportunity for that specific purpose need to be improved. But that's not, I don't think there's an intention to suggest that it tackles all of the different needs that are out there, or that one particular need is necessarily in conflict in the way we're trying to present it with any others. This is very specifically about economically disadvantaged students. And I also do want to acknowledge the point that Chair Huntsman made about these recommendations in general. We're not meaning to suggest anything particular in terms of legislative proposals or how this works out through the system or how it's received by you as a group. We really are identifying, again, based on our analysis, where we see opportunities for improvement. And with respect to like EARS and whether that stays, I think the idea here is just to suggest where we see an opportunity to improve the mechanism for how the goal of EARS is met, rather than necessarily to identify a particular proposal or, again, how state policymakers react.
Thank you. Board Member Lear.
I have a question, and I want to clarify if I'm reading this accurately. On page 27, where it shows the variety of things, but I'm looking at the bottom two sections: teachers per 1,000 weighted ADM, and then certified staff per 1,000 weighted ADM, and then the change from 2013-14 to 2017-18. And if I'm reading that correctly, it's saying that the gap is increasing, and I think it's for lower income schools or lower income students, lower income students that attend schools. I think I'm seeing the gap is increasing to create fewer teachers who are licensed and more certified staff serving students of lower income status. Is that what I'm seeing? Did I even ask that clearly enough?
So this is Justin Silverstein. Really what we're seeing here is just the variation within the statistics. So they don't really relate to one another. But what you are seeing is that between 13, 14, and 17, 18, there is more variation in the teachers per 1,000 and the certified staff per 1,000 than there was in 13, 14. In either year, the variation is at a scale that goes beyond what you would want to see when you're looking at these weighted ADM. Like ideally, when you're looking at weighted ADM, which takes into account student need, you would want this to be 0, right? Once you take into account the characteristics of students, you really see no difference in the number of teachers they have or the certified staff they have. But they're separate items. So one is just getting less equitable faster than the other, but they're very close to each other.
Okay, and so just let me kind of make sure I understand, because this is an important issue for me. Maybe I was reading such as economically disadvantaged students a little too literally. So it doesn't necessarily mean that for economically disadvantaged students, their teachers, their certified teachers are becoming fewer. Their staff is becoming more. It's just that's just one example of the kinds of students where this is changing. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to say it. Yeah, what's interesting about these statistics, you could actually have all students having more teachers per 1,000. It's just that you're just seeing it probably in wealthier districts. It's happening. It's growing faster, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean directionality. It's just that the difference across is growing, right? So there's more difference than there was in 13, 14.
Okay. Okay, not for all students, not necessarily just for those economically disadvantaged.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay, that
Yeah.
makes me feel better. I mean, kind of. And that nobody is more disadvantaged than anyone else by less qualified employees. Okay, thanks. That's all I need. Thanks.
Okay. Board Member Davis?
Thank you. I just want to, I guess, piggyback on what I heard Board Member Earl say, and I'm reading back through your recommendations here. So what she's saying in a general distribution, Morgan's at the bottom. It's probably always going to be at the bottom. You in your recommendations, am I understanding correctly, are not recommending equalization types of formulas so that a Morgan might come up to more of a Salt Lake, like a child in Morgan could potentially have the same resources that a child in Salt Lake District could have. Are you suggesting in number one, it says, distributional equity, and we talked about raising property tax so that more WPU might be afforded to those who receive state funding. But if the WPU remains the same for every student, would that do anything to change the situation of a student in Morgan? Or are you not suggesting distribution equalization formulas across the board?
I think it's a great question. I'm trying to think of the best way to approach this because it covers recommendation one and some of the recommendations that we've addressed in this section, but there's 3 and 4, which are also, we haven't quite gotten to yet. So I think that the thing I'll say is just that this recommendation is very specifically focused on adjusting for the needs of economically disadvantaged students. So in this case, that percentage of students in Morgan is not very high. And so this recommendation in particular is not, it doesn't end up being as applicable to Morgan in comparison to places with larger populations of those students, but they would still in Morgan receive the same amount of additional funding in percentage terms for students who are economically disadvantaged who are in their district. It just, because there are fewer of them, it doesn't end up as being as much as in some places where there are more. But I think just to be more directly answering your question, I don't think we're intending to say that this or all the recommendations are balancing out perfectly every aspect of equity and, as you termed it, equalization. I think more so they're meant to very specifically target parts of the system based on our analysis. We felt to make recommendations given the strength and the sort of findings that we have available. So I guess they're somewhat separate, to put it in another way, and we don't mean to imply anything about some of the others. That being said, I think that if we have an opportunity to look at all the recommendations, we might have a clearer picture of the impact on any particular district when you take all of them together. Now, Justin, if you want to add anything, I know we're at the end of our time, so I don't want to push us past. So I'll leave that to Chair Huntsman, but Justin, you might have something to follow up as well.
I mean, I think you hit it there. Really, as we look at 1 and 2, what we're trying to focus on is the pieces that can be kind of impacted for all students. And so part of what we're really showing with those equity statistics in recommendation 1 in the findings is that a lot of the variation that you currently see between a Morgan and other districts is the local voters, right? It's what the local voters have done. You have a very solid foundation formula with very solid equity principles. It's the additional dollars on the outside that start to cause more of the variation at the student level. And so we are not directly working with the board and voted leeways, in part so that you can kind of raise the vote for all. But your relative position with student need is still going to kind of stay, it's going to stay the same place. So if you don't have a lot more student need, at least for these first 2 recommendations, it's not going to drive up your revenues very much.
So
follow up, it seems like the next 3, I'm wrong, I'll look forward to listening to the next parts.
Okay. Chief of Staff Tiffany Stanley, can you maybe share with the board again the next steps after we're done with this presentation? What's next, and then we'll be able to assess how much more time we'll be spending on this topic.
Yeah, I would be happy to. So yes, this is just an information item today, but that doesn't mean the conversation ends here. WestEd and APA are working to publish a written report with a lot more detail, all the methodological information and all of that in January. In the meantime, given the broad implications of these findings and the recommendations, it's important that they be discussed with, a broad group, so local education leaders, the legislature and other stakeholders. As I think you all know, the legislature is very interested in this study, and obviously none of this could lead to policy change without legislative action. So we've been careful to keep them in the loop and having ongoing conversations. So we actually have a meeting scheduled for early next week where we'll continue that review and that coordination. So I could envision, if there is, assuming there's interest among board members to continue the conversation. I mean, I think there are a couple ways we could go about it. We could shift to committee and continue to review the recommendations with committee and kind of go that route. We could come back in January, get through the rest of these. We could do both. But either way, be sure to just keep the board in the loop as these conversations continue.
And thank you for sharing, because I think in the best interest for our board that the dialogue is really good, and I don't want us to rush through the last few pieces, but we do have an opportunity in January to kind of finish this up. But this study is going to come, the study itself is going to come to some conclusions and be complete and go before the legislature. So I don't see us having a problem, or do you, Chief of Staff Stanley, do you see us having a problem if we finish this up in January? On the time side?
Nope, timing wise, I think that's all right.
Okay, so without any objections, I think we should pick up right where we left off. And of course, the dialogue's been great and the input from board members. But it's something that we can look forward to and make sure I just don't want us to rush through it when we have this opportunity. So in the interest of still what's on our agenda, and we're more than an hour behind on a few things. Let's continue this in January.
All right, great. We'll look forward to that. And again, thank you all for your time and the great discussion. We really appreciate the opportunity to share the work.
And thank you. Okay. That's good work. And I know the legislature is anxiously awaiting this study. And as I've been tracking in that, I want to make sure it's their study and not ours, or we're trying to steer any of these recommendations or opportunities. It's good to have this independent look. It's also good to have this input of concerns that might bring a betterment to how the study is completed. So thank you for your work.